Everybody, welcome. Thank you for joining us for the discussion of NA beer, or as we're going to start talking about it, NA brew or cereal beverage or whatever you want to call it that's not beer, because legally it's not beer. This is going to be a pretty open panel discussion. I'm going to ask some questions for our speakers, but please feel free to raise your hand with questions at any time. We're going to kind of go through some process ideas. How is it made? How are ways that are made that maybe are accessible to different levels of brewery depending on your size? Maybe particular ingredient and process concerns you have to have and things you need to do differently when you're brewing. Just like I said, anybody in here making NA beer on their own? Okay, I kind of figured. So things you might need to do differently when you're, Gio, who made the beer you're drinking right now, by the way. Things you might need to think about that are a little bit different from regular brewing operations. And then we'll get into some more not cautionary, but maybe product concerns, food safety regulations, regulatory concerns that do apply to NA brew or beer that are not regular for things we're normally used to. And then we'll kind of talk a little bit about financial side of this. Is this a money-making venture for most of us? Because in the end, we all love beer, we're all looking to make beer. We do eventually have bills to pay. Even the guy who works at the culinary school has to pay bills. So to start, let me introduce you to our speakers for today. Laura Dierks is the owner of Interboro Spirits and Ales. Ben Jordan is the CEO of ABV Technology out of Minneapolis. If any of you were at the CBC in Minneapolis last year, there was a tremendous amount of non-alcoholic content, both in product, seminars, equipment, everything. And so he's going to talk about some cool stuff there. And Mike McManus is Director of Brewing Ops at Industrial Arts Brewing, who helped create the beer you're all drinking. If anyone didn't get a beer, please let me know. I'll bring you one. Thank you. Sorry, the cereal beverage. The cereal beverage that you're all, the IPA, which is not a branded term. We can use the term IPA for this, that you're all drinking right now. So just to kind of get us started, we're going to talk a little bit about the actual processes. Like, what are the ways in which NA beer is made? Ben, if you wouldn't mind starting us off, just talking about some of the different techniques that might be used for making NA brew.
Sure. Can everybody hear me in the back? Yeah, great. Yes? Good. Okay. Well, thanks a lot. I appreciate you guys inviting me here. There's a lot of different ways to make non-alcoholic beer. So if you're going to enter the game of non-alcoholic beer, cereal beverage, whatever you want to refer to it as here, there's a number of different considerations that you might have on how you want to make it. And one place to start is sort of with flavor and recipe and your decisions around what you want your brand to taste like, what you want your beer to taste like. Another consideration might be financial. What is the outcome of this process that you're going to implement? How much is it going to cost to do the R&D? How much is it going to cost to buy the equipment? And other concerns maybe around tertiary equipment like pasteurizers, for example, which will be an important part of this conversation when we talk about safety. I'd say there's three main categories. In fact, I'll start with the first decision you have to make. Do you want to start with a fully fermented beer, or do you want to build a beer that you halt the fermentation on before it reaches a higher percentage ABV? The halted fermentation approach has a lot of advantages, which you're going to talk about quite a bit. You can start with ingredients that you already know how to brew with. There's a little bit of R&D involved to figure out how you make that beverage and how you adapt your current brewing processes to make a beer. And there's going to be some advantages in terms of cost, and there might be some disadvantages to flavor, advantages to flavor that I'm really not an expert in that side of things. And I'll let you guys talk about where you might see advantages and disadvantages. If you decide that you're going to start with a fully fermented beverage because you've decided that that's the way you want to go, there's a couple different routes there. I'm going to explain my rationale behind why I think that approach works the best for a lot of my customers. Making a fully fermented beverage means you put your beverage through the full fermentation process. The yeast has done its job. You've produced ethanol. The ethanol that you've produced is now able to do things like dry hopping, and you get that full flavor profile associated with a fully fermented beverage before you take the next step. So what's the next step? Dealcoholization is the typical name for the process. There's two primary ways to do it. One is through something called a membrane separation step. You might have heard of this as RO. You might have heard of this as nanofiltration or ultrafiltration, pervaporation. There's lots of different terms here, but the concept is very simple in all ways. It's that you've got a big sheet that has a bunch of small holes in it, and you either are pulling vacuum on one side or heating the other side, and you're forcing that beer to push the alcohol through one side while keeping maybe the larger molecules on the other side of that membrane. By doing that in several stages, you can separate aromas from ethanol, from larger molecules of sugar, and other things, proteins that might have been in the beer. That theme that I'm talking about of doing a two-stage separation to keep the aromas, pull the alcohol out, and keep the other large molecules, that theme is the way that all of these separation processes work. Again, there's details around exactly which membrane process you use. People at GIA, people at Alpha Laval, people at ProBrew out of Wisconsin, they all make skids that do this membrane separation process. In fact, there's lots of others as well. The other approach is to use something called evaporative separation. This might be called distillation, this might be called spinning cone. You might have heard of lots of different technology approaches to this. The scheme is the same, except for you're doing it in a different way. Instead of pushing those molecules through a membrane to separate them, you're heating up that beer a small amount, you're pulling vacuum on that beer to reduce the boiling point, and in two stages you separate out the aromas, put that in one stream, pull out the alcohol, put that in a second stream, combine that third remaining fraction with the aromatic fraction, and that's non-alcoholic cereal beverage or non-alcoholic beer. There's a lot of detractors and benefits to any of the three approaches I just mentioned. I'll tell you why I think that the evaporative approach works well for us. It gives us the flexibility to work with craft breweries. Our company is designed to work with craft breweries. We make a skid that does something between 6,000 and 12,000 barrels a year, depending on which options you choose. Our customers are able to take any beer in their portfolio, whether it's a hazy IPA, a 17% dark ale, a 4% session ale, whatever it is, run it through our skid, and it is able to make a non-alcoholic version of that beer. And then the other byproduct is the fermented malt beverage, which is the clear fraction that comes out of that. An important distinction here is that you get, if you put in a fully fermented beer and run it through one of these separation processes, you get out a non-alcoholic beer, and then you get out a clear component, a clear beer, that is still classified as beer, which means you can do things like mix in other flavors and make hard seltzers or other cocktails. Maybe you wouldn't want to call them cocktails if you were labeling them, but you get the point. There are some details here around recipe development that we're going to get into, but I think I'm going to stop here and just say that's sort of the survey of the technology at this point.
Great. And Mike, would you talk a little bit about the process you went through choosing to do the particular, like why you chose that process, and maybe a little bit more of the R&D side of how things kind of got you this, because you guys are now a full, almost more than a year, right, into developing this product and now have it market.
Yeah. Caveat that this is our experience. There's a lot of different ways to do this, and I think a lot of the assumptions that we all have around traditional beer brewing do not apply to this process. So we use a yeast that does not ferment maltose and maltotriose. If given the time, that yeast will find a way to drop gravity. So arrested fermentation can be used with traditional yeast, but in this case, we set a time limit on how soon we have to crash, even though the yeast supplier says, it's not going to ferment these sugars. So that's in very much a different way of thinking about sending a beer that you already make through to make a non-alcoholic cereal beverage. We are imagining this from the ground up, and it's sort of changed it's changed the way we think about brewing beer, and that's in large part because of the food safety and the regulatory things that go along with this. So that the distinction that really took me by surprise was the distinction between food safety and quality. And I think as brewers, we've spent a very long time getting comfortable with the fact that when we make a bad batch of beer, it's not going to hurt anybody. It's going to hurt, it's going to hurt us, but it's not physically going to hurt anybody. With a cereal beverage, like, you can do some real damage. So there are hard and fast guidelines, and then there's a lot of stuff that you need to sort of figure out. So R&D for us was over a year on 2 brands, and we're learning, like, we need reps. We're learning every time we brew these. We're learning, peeling back the onion a little bit. But the food safety implications are all those things that, like, prevent your product from being injurious to the customer, the consumer, and then the quality aspects are the things that your customer finds valuable. For us, that was really like the process of learning that and trying to embody that is like sort of a cultural shift. We installed these like food safety zones in the brewery, and it's yellow and black tape. And inside that zone, like, the rules are different, and it's very, like, stepping over that line is like, it has real practical differences, and then it's like sort of a mindset shift. So we're like scrubbing in. We have hand washing stations. So because we produce all of our beer in that area, it's changed the way we have to brew beer as well. Do you want anything more specific about how
since we started talking about, like, the different ways in which you can go about this, would it be fair to say that you guys chose this path from a perspective of scalability, right? You wanted to bring a product to market on a large scale, so you need something that would allow you to do that, as well as equipment cost up front, right? The investment you're willing to make in, going with a non-Saccharomyces or non-traditional yeast, versus going with one of the large, the filtration type systems that Ben was talking about, versus something else.
Yeah, I mean, this is the method in which we're making NA involves pasteurization. It's an essential element. I mean, some people will say, I can manage this in my tap room, or for us, that's a hard line. But yeah, it's getting to the market and scalability.
Yeah.
So there are some throughput issues with some of the other ways.
Yep.
I've started to think about pasteurization differently too, because it's like, I attended a pasteurization talk at MBAA last year, and the speaker said that they called their pasteurizer the second QC manager. But sensory is a big part of this. We do weekly shelf life stability tests on the NA products, and we're learning a lot about, like, what pasteurization does as far as, like, aging the beer up front, and then what it does as far as, like, preserving some sort of shelf life down the line. So, I mean, it really is like such a matrix of issues that you had no idea about, and a real, like, a real challenging and rewarding process, like, way more challenging.
But you guys are doing tunnel pasteurization?
Tunnel
In
pasteurization.
can? Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
Lord, you want to talk a little bit about, sorry, got you.
Yeah,
Just
just
one
a
second.
question. You're speaking of food safety and the food safety zones. What is the final plate on this beer? Are you worried about it becoming a bomb, or are you worried about it?
Well, so one of the major things is the FDA. We're under FDA scrutiny now. Anybody who makes a product like this is. One of the hard lines for a high acid food, or what the FDA considers to be acid added or a high acid food, is a pH below 4.6, and that's because that is the level at which the botulism toxin will not be produced by the spore that is basically everywhere. So those sort of hard lines that's what I'm talking about when I say, like, this isn't just going to hurt our egos if it goes poorly. Like, the stakes are a little bit higher. So yeah, re-fermentation is certainly a concern. That's a quality concern. But botulism is a food safety concern.
You use, like, potassium sorbate?
No, we pasteurize. We pasteurize. Yeah. And pH control and pasteurization are two big things.
And that's where, I mean, the sort of FDA versus TTB kind of comes in too, right? Where you get below into places where the FDA is going to care about it. So the path that we chose on our NA R&D that we're still working on was to go the separation path, and we did it for two different reasons. One is that we weren't necessarily ready to go down that path and try to do it ourselves, but also in order to end up with two products in the end, right? So we'd end up with the NA beer and then the basically like hard seltzer on the other side. That we could, because we make RTD cocktails, those RTD cocktails are distillate, right, which then fall into a liquor category, can only be sold in certain places. So the hard seltzer being basically because the alcohol came out of the beer, it still qualifies as a malt-based product and beer from a sale perspective. We could then flavor that and make it into cocktails. And thinking that might be a path on the sales side that might be interesting for us to pursue as well.
Right, because all of a sudden you can put that in the store next to the beer.
Absolutely, yeah, where we can't put our RTDs.
Right.
So did Industrial Arts, did you do the same process that they're doing as far as removing the alcohol, turning it into seltzer, or they're?
No. We're making a low gravity beer under different mashing and watering conditions than you would normally.
Like alcohol in order to?
Then we're using a yeast that does not ferment.
Okay.
So we'll mash. It's a bizarre mashing regime.
Yeah.
And then pH control throughout the process, and then utilizing no oxygen, for instance, like using a yeast that does not ferment maltose and maltotriose, keeping the gravity low, and then pasteurizing to provide your food safety.
Can we speak on the different mash or, and the yeast?
Yeah, that actually kind of gets to our next topic, which was, what are the different ingredients and techniques you're going to use to make that. And I'm actually really curious if you ever took that different mash regime and then just threw Saccharomyces in there to see what came out of it and make some sort of like wacky, super leftover dextrin
Make
beer.
like another product nobody
Yeah,
wants
like,
to drink.
like some sort
So, I mean, basically mash hotter than you ever have. But not too hot, because we found that,
So Fulton Cannon.
yeah, pull tannins, yep.
172.
Yeah, exactly. And then pH control, and then this bizarre thing happened where we started getting stuck mashes because the bed is too shallow.
That's an equipment thing. You're using so little grain in your
Yeah.
larger system that it wasn't designed to handle
Right.
something that small.
Then keeping the pH, because of the proportion of sparge water is so much greater than it normally is, keeping the pH of that added liquor in.
Longer than other times.
Yeah, so the important thing for us, one thing that we built out and really used everywhere else in the brewery is establishing operational limits for every single thing we measure. So those are based on historical data you collect. Data collection is a big part of this, and then your technical aspirations, like what do we think is possible here. So if we have for instance, if the lauter time exceeds our operational limits, then we have to make a decision about whether we're going to keep that batch. So you set yourself guardrails and try to stay within them. When you're outside of them, you have to decide if you want to change your operational limits or course correct.
Right.
There are other, in my brewing history, we talked about critical control points as being these things that are really critical to your process and the quality of your product. But in food safety, a critical control point is if you're outside of those operational limits on those things, you've lost control of the process. That would be pH. A bright beer pH of 4.7, dump that shit. That, it's not good.
I'll just jump in on the food safety side of things and just add a little color there. We, as a manufacturer and a service provider, we don't get final control over what our customers do for food safety. We recommend pasteurization. We also have customers who use preservatives. Your question about potassium metabisulfite and potassium sorbate, we have customers who purely use preservatives and do no pasteurization. To your point, they keep the pH super low. This is a Goza style or stuff around pH 3.5, as high as pH 4. And those customers, as long as they've had decent controls, have had good shelf lives. It's not the answer a lot of people want to hear me say up here, but I don't have final control over it. That's why we recommend good processes. Of course, the FDA guidelines you're mentioning. There's a great BA article that came out about 2 months ago that goes into lots of detail about non-alcoholic beverage production that lays out a lot of these things. I can't say can you make a non-alcoholic beer that doesn't use pasteurization? Yes. Is the risk higher? Yes, much higher. And it's not just, botulism, botulinum toxin. It's fecal coliform and E. coli and listeria that all can now grow in the low alcohol environment, high pH environment. None of those things are really great to put in a beverage. So.
Are there other considerations you would have for, basic ingredients? So obviously you've talked about different strain of yeast, hops, malt, other products that you're saying, we would normally use these hops or these malts, and these are no longer working in the low ABV or non-alc products. Did you have to change base malt? Did you have to change your different hops? Did you find that certain things, because of the absence of alcohol or because of the pasteurization techniques, were no longer the way you wanted them to be?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, but we're still learning a lot of that stuff. Right. But I would say in general, like keeping it reasonably simple seems to take some of the variables out of play. Certainly with a really low Plato beer, there is not, a lot of these yeasts that are available. Number one, you can't harvest them. I don't know of a supplier that recommends harvesting any of these yeasts. Some are Saccharomyces, some are other things. Most of them are POF positive, so like your mileage will vary if you're planning on using wheat and don't want 4VG in your beer. Dry hopping would be something that we've really talked a lot about. Like once it's in that tank, and like you're going to crash it pretty soon, and the risk is reasonably high. Every time you have a tank touch, like I would prefer not to open it up and add something to it at that point. So yeah, building hop flavor in the brew house is like that was a big hurdle. Yeah.
And with pasteurization as well, building hop flavor or building hop aroma with pasteurization.
In general, I've been surprised at how my assumptions about pasteurization have changed, because I do think that nobody is going to be examining your beer more than you are. If there came a time where like Jeff and I would be tasting the Bright Tank all the time and then comparing it to the pasteurization, and eventually it's just like we can't learn anything from the Bright Tank so much, like we have to.
Right, this is not the product we're selling. This is the product we're selling.
And pasteurization is a whole other topic. But yeah, determining your kill rate, verifying that your yeast load or bacterial load has gone down enough that you're comfortable with the product. Like dome staining. Turns out cans like get stained when it's hot. So like these things are just things you figure out as you go, and we're still very much learning.
Yeah, do you only can this beer?
No kegs. No kegs.
Okay.
Yeah, we're going to get in the draft. We're going to get in the draft in a minute. Yeah.
From the other side of things, I'll grab questions in a second. From the other side of starting with a fermented beverage and doing dealcoholization, on the recipe side of things, we've run several hundred different recipes of beer through our processes that our customers have made, and the results are always very interesting. If you give me a clean Pilsner, a lager, a Helles, I can pretty much, a Kolsch, I can tell you it's going to work excellent through a membrane or through one of our systems or any process. If you give me a hazy IPA with lactose in it, some fruit juice, and whatever else you've added to it, it gets a little harder to predict. And the reasons why are kind of fascinating. The lack of ethanol not only causes more of a risk on the food safety side, but it actually changes the way you perceive beer. There's a bunch of receptors in the back of your throat that are part of the TRP family of receptors. Last year's Nobel Prize in Chemistry was all about TRP receptors. The presence of ethanol changes the binding affinity of those receptors. So a good question that explains my point here is like, why does it feel like it's burning when you drink whiskey? It's not because it's burning you. It's because this family of receptors, which is designed to measure heat and give you a warning when you put something too hot in your mouth, has now been brought down in its affinity to the point where it's giving your brain a false positive saying that you're now perceiving burning. That same family of receptors perceives bitterness, capsaicin, and a whole bunch of other sort of small compounds that exist in both malt and hops. So the absence of ethanol changes the way we all perceive beer as well. We've done all the GCMS studies and HPLC studies to show that I put in a beer, this is the concentrations of 60 different chemicals in it. I run it through my dealcoholization process, concentrations are the same to within 5%, except the ethanol's gone. Tastes completely different. And that is one of the realities of doing alcohol separation. You're going to change the way you perceive things.
Does that flavor transfer over from, if you have like that super fruited sour through your process and put it into a seltzer base, do you still get that flavor in the final product?
It's an awesome question. If you came into my office, there's a chart on the wall that's 6 feet tall that has 450 different chemicals in it that says which way that chemical goes when it runs through the process. It's fascinating what happens. You can give me a guava goza, and 100% of that guava flavor will come through. And then if you give me a really good Citra hop that has a super citrusy flavor, it'll reduce it by half of its total load, and you'll go below your tasting thresholds. So it's a very complicated equation. We have good data to suggest what happens that can guide you. We've found, and this might sound a little bit naive, but we found the best answer is try it. The minimum run size is a keg. So take your best recipes, run them through the process, see what happens. Usually you get good results. Sometimes you get really weird results. And of course your tasting panels are going to have varied answers to that as well.
Is there any kind of minimum that you guys have for your process?
We'll do as little as a keg in any of our facilities, test it out. A typical customer will send us a pallet of 4 to 8 different recipes, and they'll like 4 of them. Other notes I guess I'll suggest here is like head reduction or increase in bubble size is a problem in NAs. You get fish eyes a lot. You can add more oats to your boil to make up for that. You get more head stability. Adding things like Tannyl A to do more stabilization can help. With evaporative processes like the ones we use, you can put in a hazy and get out a hazy. With a membrane process, you put in a hazy, you get out a clear ale. There's a lot of other sort of subtle things. Dry hopping was the third thing I'll mention. The safety risk is high, right? So like, as you said, you don't want to open up a tank and throw in a big bag of hops, right? Especially with the risk there. So what do? Well, the other point I'll mention there is most of the things you want out of hops come out of hops because of the presence of ethanol. Ethanol is a solvent, it pulls things out of hops. You want that ethanol. Without ethanol, you put hops in there and you only get out really a half of the things you want. So dry hopping can be really problematic. Luckily, our friends in all the hop companies have come out with lots of nice additives that can bring aromas back and bittering back. Those sterile additives, oils, etc., can be a good way to get back some of those hop aromas and rebalance your NAs.
So you mentioned Tannyl A, and I was also wondering for you, Mike, are there any other process aids, that maybe you would not normally be using in a regular beer that you've now decided are necessary or helpful in the creation of the NA beer? Cereal beverage.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they're things mostly for flavor stability, for
Well, yeah. One of the other challenges. I mean, we're just like listing a lot of challenges.
right.
But one of the other challenges is that, like, you know, some enzymes or ingredients that you're used to using are just not going to work because the mash, like the temperature of the mash is just not going to allow the action of some enzymes you might have used to provide some laudability aid or colloidal stability in the mash. There's a lot of, I should also mention that, like, you know, there's not a ton of information out there about, but there are some good resources about brewing NA beer. So we're new members of ANBA, which is the Adult Non-Alcoholic Beverage Association, and they're doing some good work on process authorities, food safety standardization, marketing, and understanding, you know, the financial side of things. And then MBAA in the last technical quarterly did like a lit review of some pasteurization stuff that I wish I had a year ago. But for instance, like when we thought about improving laudability, you know, like bioglucanase came to mind, but we were outside of that temperature range because it's an enzyme. There's some evidence that gallic acid or gallatannins, you know, can improve your laudability. They chelate iron. It's gushing negative. And then really pH control in the water ton was a big thing for us to learn. The nice thing about Tannol B or gallic acid is that, you know, you can use it in conjunction with some sort of cattle fining. There's no, they're not butting heads.
Okay. I know we have some questions. Let's get Ivan.
Do you have to go through full HACCP certification to do this?
Full asset certification?
HACCP.
HACCP. Our customers do, we don't. Obviously, we recommend that they do go through all of the food safety requirements that are necessary. Our facilities typically do that. I can't think of one that hasn't, but I can't be for sure. So, yes, you should.
So we immediately established a food safety team, and then a full food safety plan. And then when you exceed 5% revenue, you're required to have some of these things really kick in. A process authority, you know, there are a couple. Cornell, the Center for Excellence, Cornell does a lot of this work. So you would submit in every detail you can provide what the process is, tie SOPs back to flow diagrams, and then they will audit your process and basically, you know, provide some insight to you as to how, you know, how safe they consider it to be. Yeah, we have a weekly food safety meeting now, and we discuss current good manufacturing practice, and that's a big thing. Is tying your SOPs back to what the FDA says is appropriate.
Is the difference between your process cost for you guys or recipe development? Because like you guys kind of brew a non-alcoholic beer when you start, they kind of strip a wrench on the way out.
Yeah, I mean, pasteurization is really energy intensive. Although, you know, the newer machines use a lot of, you know, pumping back and forth between zones, so you can reuse some of that water. R&D cost for us was you know, is going to impact the ROI for sure. So I think that, you know, the more we talk about this, the easier it's going to become for some folks. But you know, there's a lot of things that like we wish we had known, and we just figured out the hard way.
And what are you finding is, now that you have a product in cans in the market, can you price it the same? Like how are customers reacting to a price point?
I mean, there's a whole field study about that.
Right.
But for instance, to the point made earlier, we have to overuse hops, right? Use hops at a way higher rate than you would for even like a pale ale to get a aroma like this. It's because we don't get the extract of the solvent from the solvent that pump. We see on the cost side, it lines up with like pale ale.
Okay.
Like it's not less expensive than ale. It's a little bit quicker, which is helpful, but it's in line with a beer that's not huge consumer of raw material.
Are you guys finding it worth it? I mean, this is a lot, like, you chose to do this, I mean, to get into some part of the industry. Is this all worth it, profitability?
I mean, time will tell on that. Like, we've been selling it for 3 months, but
Okay.
the early returns are good, and there's clearly a new audience for it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Athletic would say it's worth it.
But we for sure want
Oh, yeah, you have like folks that, you know, I'm just saying it's an added thing that you guys have to change, and now you're adding like meetings and all this other stuff. I'm just, that all adds up.
Yeah, it's a great question.
So,
It's,
yeah.
it's a lot of compliance, a lot more compliance.
It's making us better brewers.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And to your point, I think, you know, on the separation side of things, you get the flexibility of recipe, so you can address the full breadth of the market. You know, the NA market doesn't just mean a golden O'Doul's-like clone. You know, it means all the recipes and all the styles. So if you think that's a good thing for your brewery to be able to take your portfolio and make it, you know, to de-alkalize it, I think that is one way that you can make up for the cost. If you go the separation route, the upfront cost, your minimum upfront cost is going to be, to buy a machine, is going to be somewhere in the $300,000 range. If you bring it to a processing facility like we or other providers offer, Octopi, for example, is another one. You know, you can do that for as little as $100 a barrel. But, you know, as you scale up, you're going to want to get your own machine at some point.
And I think this is an appropriate time to mention that Ben's company does license machines, and they do have one here in New York at Captain Lawrence, and are running test batches, and a lot of us have run through that before, which is kind of how we all got hooked up. So for those of us that are taproom brewers, that is an avenue available to you for a draft product, which we'll talk more about draft in a minute.
And then I'd just add that the other part of this is all the compliance, right? And all the additional overhead and making sure that you're doing all the processes and have all the SOPs and make sure that you have all that in place in order to just make sure that you're doing the right thing safety-wise. And the only reason we considered it is because we are a distillery as well. And so I already have a lot of overhead in compliance in that area too, so.
So I think it's an appropriate time to talk about draft and the challenges that come with draft and some of the other challenges maybe that come with trying to make this product. I mean, I think one of the things I found very interesting, just in picking Mike's brain a lot, is you know, carbonation is an issue. It's things do not happen the same way without the presence of ethanol. So Ben, since since the equipment that we've worked with you is mostly draft focused, what are some of the concerns that come with a draft NA product versus a packaged NA product?
And I'll clarify, I don't think, you know, we do a lot of keg beer, but it's not necessarily draft focused.
Okay.
I would say the majority of our customers do mostly distribution.
Okay.
So the majority of the volume anyways, although we can do, you know, as small as kegs,
Sure.
of course. There are, I think in that BA article, for example, that I'm referring to, this is August 2022, I believe it came out. I think the argument was that you shouldn't be releasing non-alcoholic beer in kegs. Now, last month Athletic did. So how do they do it and how do they get around the concerns? The biggest concern is, right, once that keg leaves your facility, what are the tap lines that's going to get attached to? Where is it going to get stored? Is that warm keg of non-alcoholic beer now going to sit on a floor for 3.5 months and then get plugged into a dirty tap line at a random bar? It's probably not going to be the best for that beverage that's already at a high risk. If you can get chain of custody and understand cooling and understand draft line quality, I think it's okay to do this, but it's a must. Most of our customers don't release kegs of non-alcoholic beer. If they do put them in kegs and sell them, it's on their own draft lines in their own tap room. But the advantage is huge because now they've got a huge new population of people coming into the tap room that wouldn't come in before. They have a non-alcoholic option, so the advantages are big if you can do the quality control.
Do you still have to pasteurize it if you're keeping it in-house in keg?
Again, we don't have control over it as the provider, as the manufacturer, but we do recommend that they do inline pasteurization on the way into the keg, and they have sterile kegs. Often it's in containers.
Like we have so much control over it, doesn't alleviate that risk.
It doesn't fully alleviate the risk. You're doing in a keg, it's not only rare to have a tunnel pasteurizer, it's much rarer to have a keg pasteurizer. So you're going to want to use sterile kegs that have been evacuated appropriately. Often containers are the better way to go because you don't have any risk of reuse, anything left in the keg. And even in that situation, you have to be pretty careful about the draft lines and things like that. We have not had a keg go bad with any of our customers that we know of, but that's not something people really advertise either. So.
Is that helping to a lot of inspections? Is this helping you to a lot of these inspections?
Certainly could. Yeah. I mean, that's what we're preparing for.
They haven't visited you guys?
No, not specifically. But I mean, we've reached out to a process authority to make sure we're, trying to tick the boxes. We've chosen not to offer draft. It's just the risk is too high for us. I mean, we put a couple kegs through the pasteurizer and it destroyed them. That was more like we were testing temperatures and stuff, but we have cans, and I realize it's a different thing, draft beer versus getting handed a poured a can in the tap room, but it's an option for it's visibility. Bright orange can, and people see it, ask what it is, and I anecdotally, like for crew beer, like our team has really enjoyed having this around. It is. It scratches that itch, and it's a little weird, like when you, there's like a variety of ways in which you can test this, and I'm sure most people in this room will do it right now. You'll have an NA, or maybe you just had a beer, and you're gonna go back out and have a delicious, real beer. So it's like, in a vacuum, like the good NA products are really, really good, and it's a tasty beverage. But it is interesting to taste them next to a real beer because it totally changes your perception. It's not beer. So.
Yeah. Anecdotally, with my students, I've been blind tasting them on NA beer and not telling them what we were doing. And I last time used your Pilsner versus a light lager I had on tap, and your NA IPA versus my IPA. And then we sat there and discussed aroma properties and flavor properties without telling them anything. And I said, oh, by the way, these are both NA beers. And they were totally flabbergasted by it. Like, they recognized some of the aroma differences and flavor differences, but they didn't understand that was why. They weren't missing that there was an alcohol in there. They were just noticing the flavors were different. So I thought it was kind of interesting.
Yeah, a friend of mine house sat for me, and I had unlabeled NA in my fridge. And when I got back, I noticed they were all in the recycling bin. There was like 5 or 6 of them. Yeah. And he didn't, I don't know what his rationale was, but
Mike makes really weak beer.
he didn't realize that he was not catching the buzz until I told him.
You had a question over here? Yes, sir.
Yeah, so just, like, my difficulty with this, and I'm guessing other people feel the same, is like, if you're a home brewer, you brew a small batch at home, you get better at that, and you open your brewery, some risk there. How do you get started here? So if you need an FDA license to make a small batch beer in your brewery, like, I think what I'd like to be able to do would be small batch beer, maybe you get the pH low, use a little preservative, see if you can get that process close, and then think about scaling it up. So can you talk a little bit about how you just get started?
Yeah, I mean, so you don't need an FDA license, so that 5% revenue does trigger some actual things, which we're preparing for. On the R&D side, we did start in the Garnerville Brewery, which is a smaller brew house than we operate now, with smaller batches. Initially, just try to get the fermentation right without throwing a ton of hops after it. We did a ton of pasteurization trials using like a sous vide, and then you can. What we do is when we run pasteurized product, we're running temperature loggers actually inside the cans, so we'll drop them in the filler, and then you pull them out and you verify your pasteurization curve, what PUs you're hitting. But initially we just used time and temperature and did some calculations, and then kind of saw what the impact was. So yeah, it was like a lot of R&D legwork, more than Game of Thrones beers, for instance. It's like a lot more.
If you were ever to do those, if you were able to do a whole series of beer for an
Yeah.
HBO show.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd just say that same thing. It's gonna just take a lot of time and energy, and at those points where you hit certain thresholds, you will have to deal with the FDA. And then there's just the risk of like, you do want to know what you're doing if you're putting product out there, because your insurance provider will certainly want to know, and so you don't want to risk on that side or risk people's health, obviously.
The food safety implications, like that's like several other presentations.
I'll maybe make a counter argument to these 2 points, which is, using a membrane or evaporative process, you can get started very easily. Pick a beer that you know how to brew well, that your customers like. Put it through the process as, a keg or a 2 or a tote or a tanker, whatever is a small amount for you. Run it through, put it on tap, maybe put some preservatives in it, or manage it extremely well and keep track of it, and see what comes back from your sensory panel. See what comes back from your customers. There's nothing here that says you have to brew a brand new beer necessarily. If you want to go the approach these guys went, there's a little bit of upfront work, but the cost savings is big to your point, right? If you can get past some of the R&D, now you don't have to buy a $350,000 piece of equipment from me or somebody, hopefully from me. But if you want to go that approach, you can ship a keg to Scott down at Captain Lawrence, and he'll turn it into a non-alcoholic beer for you and give you back the seltzer to boot, and see what you think of the recipes you already know well. So maybe this is a good transition into the sort of financial and benefits side of things.
That's a good way to wrap it up.
When we started this business, the point was to make good non-alcoholic beer. I'll just share a brief anecdote here of like why I would do an insane thing like this. I love beer. I've been in beer for a long time. I've brewed, I've made wine, I've done all sorts of different things. And as maybe many of you have experienced, you can't drink 10% IPAs all day. And so I wanted to still be social, but I wanted to, don't give me that look. I wanted to be social, but I knew that I had to get up in the morning. That's essentially the story. So I built this little machine that would do dealcoholization. And it's just because that's the kind of thing I like to do in my spare time. The result of it was that we were able to, by taking advantage of some new technology, we were able to make really good NA beer. What I didn't expect was that the market growth wouldn't be due to people who didn't want to drink at all. Most of the market growth that you've seen, if you were in the previous talk about market data from last year, growth in the NA segment isn't from people who are recovering alcoholics, pregnant women, and religiously averse people. It's the people who are drinking regular beer who also want to drink non-alcoholic beer maybe before 5 p.m., maybe on a Tuesday, maybe when they're pregnant. I don't know. The CDC says don't do that, so I'm not recommending it. But I think that the point is that the growth here is due to people who are drinking and also choosing to drink non-alcoholic beer. The growth, in fact, in the whole category has been in the spectrum, that there's non-alcoholic, low alcoholic, and regular beer across that range, so that you can go have an IPA, maybe have a Saison, and then go, drop down to an NA before you drive home. The rules are getting stricter about, driving and things like that, so I think a lot of the growth has come there as well. The benefit on the financial side to a lot of breweries that we've seen is that they get more people in their tap rooms and they sell more beer, and that's bar none. That's what we all want in some sense. That growth comes from what I see as think of the group that's going to go out at night. You've got 2 people who love beer, maybe one person who doesn't want gluten in their diet, and one person who doesn't want alcohol at all. If that group wants to go out, they can't come to your tap room because 2 of those people can't drink. Now you add a seltzer, maybe that third person can come. If you add the non-alcoholic beer, now the whole group can come. And that increases volume to your tap room. That's the results we've seen from the 300 some customers we have, is that they see increased tap room volume. And that's a different story than the athletic story. With $50 million of Dr. Pepper Keurig money, you can do a lot of things. The craft brewery who wants to increase volume to their tap room and maybe increase distribution can do it with the tech that's available now or with recipe tools and yeasts that are available now, and they see increased revenues. On the financial side of things, maybe you want to talk about how things are gone for you guys?
I was just gonna say from an owner's standpoint, I'm sure Jeff, you might say the same thing, is like looking at the growth in the market and thinking about these things, about the availability of other things to provide into the market. That was certainly why we were looking into it as well. To be able to offer all sorts of different things in our tap room and then perhaps to other people.
I think what you told me yesterday, Jeff, was what the NA is now at 1% of the overall beer market, but it's 30% of that is craft.
30% of that is craft, and half that is beverage.
So that tells you how much people are going into this quickly.
Another point here is maybe on price point. NA beer is perceived as a premium product coming out of craft breweries. The price per case is around $33 per case equivalents. It means you can charge a decent amount. It's not, the early criticisms or conversations that I had with various people are like, well, there's no alcohol, shouldn't it be less money? Well, they didn't understand the process, which in our case or in separation process case adds a process step and adds money. But also, like, ethanol's $1.49 a gallon. If you want the ethanol back, I'll pour you a shot. Don't worry. That's not the issue. So people see it just like they see Swiss processed decaffeinated coffee, right? You're buying a premium product that is only available because of some new tech now. So I don't know if you guys have seen it the same way, but at least our customers have seen that they can charge a premium for those things, both in the tap room and in distribution.
Do we have further questions? Any final thoughts for you guys? Yeah.
When you remove the alcohol, why is this not considered concentration distillation?
Great question. Great question. We'd been talking about this earlier today. If you want the detailed answer, I'll forward you an email. I've written several legal opinions on the matter, but it's the short answer is TTB says that when you have a process that doesn't rectify or increase the concentration of alcohol through the process, regardless of what is the process, if I've got a big black box with little alcohol sorting gnomes in it, and they don't increase the concentration of the alcohol that comes out, that's not distillation in the legal definition.
What about the final product, like reconstitute the seltzer?
If I take, let's say I'll give you an example. I put in a 5% beer, I get out a 5% clear version of that beer. As long as the input ABV is equal to the output ABV, not distillation. If I take that and add flavor, carbonate it, and put it in a can, like White Claw does, or anyone really, that's still just beer. If I were to put in that 5% and get out a 20%, and then add flavor to it, now you're in the cocktail space. Same thing with wine.
Then you're like in that vodka, creating a distillate.
So like,
So technically that's distillation. There's even more to it than that, but yeah, it's arcane technical details that honestly they're trying to back into where the laws are and how to kind of navigate the fact that none of this really fits anyway. Yeah, there's some technical fine lines that they've drawn. It isn't distillation.
yeah, so when we were designing our machine, the original literature would say, put in a 5% beer, get out a non-alcoholic cereal beverage, and then have a byproduct that is the 5% ethanol. We had to switch the literature based on advice from the TTB that said, put in a 5% beer, get out a 5% clear beer, and a byproduct that's non-alcoholic beer. And that fit with CFR 25248 and Rule 1, Sec 67. Yeah, exactly. I'll send you the email.
One thing I'll tag on is, since I work at a college, I was obviously very interested in being able to sell a product to people who are not 21. And from what I've been told by Stephen Fleming, now the SLA has not made an official ruling, but they are following the TTB's guidance. TTB's guidance is that this is not beer. And it can be sold any place you sell things that aren't beer. And so,
there is.
No, it's beer, and it's beer in some categories. Part of it is that the FAA Act doesn't agree with some of the TTB rules, and so it depends on which part you read. And so it's hard.
We're not saying that 18-year-old, 17-year-old, 13-year-old coming and saying, can I get that non-alcoholic beer.
I was told that I can sell this product to anybody who can buy a product that is not beer. That's what I was told. That's not a legal ruling by the SLA. That's what Stefan told me.
But
Yeah,
but there's a couple, there's a lot.
That's SLA.
So, yeah, what the federal government
Yeah.
says may be different.
Federal government says is a good question. What state by state happens is
Yeah.
different.
State by state.
Mike was just saying, like, can you drive with it? Depends on the state you're in.
Yeah.
The other thing is, if you start with a fully fermented beer and you do the dealcoholization step, formula approval is necessary. If you export it out of the state, cola is necessary. You got to make sure you follow state labeling requirements, which means that you've got to put near beer or non-alcoholic cereal beverage on the side, and it has to qualify for the tax code distinction. There's a couple little labeling requirements. TTB's 2021 CBC presentation has every one of these details in it. Really, really great presentation. You can find it on their website or ask me for it.
And I'd say too, I mean, there are really interesting questions to say, like, where does the jurisdiction start and end too? Like, if you were to make this product in New York, and New York doesn't really, you know, Stefan might be the final say in some of these things if you're not selling it across state lines. Because a lot of the jurisdiction that the TTB has is determined by interstate commerce. So they may not have a way to say what it is if you didn't sell it across state lines. So God only knows where that leaves
Yeah,
anybody.
also knowing
in
the
the
SLA
answers.
is not the one who's going to arrest somebody for selling a product. It's legal authorities, right? So I'm not saying that that's what they're saying. That's the same what the SLA was telling us.
And the last thing I'll say is to poke the bear even more, we have a lot of different customers. Some of you might have heard me mention in the other talk on market data. Minnesota passed a law that now allows breweries to put cannabis-derived THC into non-alcoholic beverages. A lot of our customers' business now is dealcoholizing beverages, putting THC into it and selling it in their tap rooms, either as distribution or on tap. So the non-alcoholic space has a lot of room to grow, not just for people who don't want to drink beer, but in other places as well.
And that about takes us to our hour, unless there's any final questions. Thank you very much to our speakers. This was really cool. Really appreciate it.